You know, as an avid fan of history, not just US history, but ancient history, and even current events, I've always been fascinated by, certain events that kind of change the timeline and how we think about, the world that we live in, particularly here in the United States. One of those things that actually has always kind of captivated me because, the answer was never given was TWA Flight 800. It was actually really interesting because, obviously it was a tragedy, but it was one of those things where, different people said different things about what actually happened. And the investigation itself, well, I was pretty young at that time, but not too young to understand what was going on. It did seem like, something was a little off with everything that occurred with, TWA Flight 800. As far as the explanation of what happened and what, other eyewitnesses said about, just everything. It was pretty crazy. But the really interesting thing to me is that this was in the pre 9/11 world. So it was a completely different environment than, everything that we've known post 9/11. But I look back at that and I think, there's so many different things that could have occurred, which would explain, why, let's say, the FBI and the CIA were involved in this, the investigation, the role the military played and all of that. But, at the end of the day, I always try to tell myself that, the mundane explanation is usually probably, the truth. However, I mean, just during my downtime, I was actually looking I was watching some airline show, and it suggested, the TWA Flight 800 documentary. So I was like, all right, I've got some time, let's do it. So I took a look at it and I was watching it and I was like, you know what? I do remember these things at the time. People, right when the plane, was lost, people were saying, hey, I saw something going up towards the plane. I saw, a rocket hit the plane. I saw all of these different things. And it was multiple people from multiple places that had no relation to each other. And so obviously, at that time, it was kind of crazy because myself, I remember it was during the Gulf War, right? The cruiser Vincennes in the Gulf shot down a civilian airliner by mistake, right? And that was, a pretty big deal. Now, obviously, it wasn't an American airliner, otherwise it would have been a much different issue. But it was my first thought because that was fresh in my mind because the time frame wasn't that long. And I was like, because at the time that TWA Flight 800 crashed, they were talking about, there being restricted airspace nearby, and the Navy was conducting, training and blah, blah, blah. But I was still asking myself, how likely is it that, an airliner, a domestic airliner, could really realistically be shot down by the military accidentally? That would be there would definitely be no way really to erase the paper trail on that one, right? I mean, everybody would know what happened in short order. So it was very crazy because, obviously, the wreckage was found and the black boxes and all of that. But I remember, the investigation at the end, and it took years, right? They ended up saying that it was the fuel tank, the center fuel tank that exploded and this and that. And I was like, okay, well, there it is. That's what happened. And they had a whole, story about why that happened, that, the flight was delayed and it sat on the tarmac, for hours in the heat, and, the air conditioning was running, and somehow or another something overheated and it ended up exploding, in the air. Okay. I'm not a aeronautics engineer, so I can't say, what's plausible, what's not. But that's what was really interesting about this documentary, TWA, Flight 800, was it was actually the people from the NTSB who were responsible for investigating it, who were saying, there was definitely a cover-up, it wasn't in our hands. The narratives put out by the FBI and the CIA were completely bogus. They don't line up with the data. So, think about it. When you think about conspiracy theories, we hear them all the time, right? We just went through an event where, there's a billion different conspiracy theories. Who knows? Some of them could be true, but, they are conspiracy theories. Anyway, with TWA Flight 800, the interesting part was that it really did seem like something was going on at that time. But this documentary, the crazy part about it was the people from the NTSB, they have no reason to lie. That's their job. I mean, this is, they've done that their whole careers. And they were talking about incidents where, the pieces that were in the hangars when they were rebuilding TWA Flight 800, which is pretty crazy in itself. I mean, that's the first time that I've ever seen them reconstruct a jet, from wreckage. It's a really crazy concept. And I never thought that something like that would be possible until I saw that, that TWA flight. But the crazy part was what the NTSB was saying was that, and these were the actual, investigators in charge of that, were saying that, the FBI was breaking into it at night and they had surveillance footage of them, changing data, moving parts around and saying it was, tagged as this when it was really this. And not only that, but actually physically altering pieces of the plane. Like, one of the things they were saying was that, there was a guy that went in there and was hammering away, at crucial pieces of the plane to change the shape of, the pieces that were recovered. Which again, the guy from the NTSB was like, that's, absolutely 100% illegal. Like, you're altering evidence of a potential crime. But so many other things that were interesting, about what they were talking about, because apparently the NTSB wasn't in the normal loop that they would be with, crash investigations. It was basically run by the FBI and the CIA to run, apparently the investigation. But so many things that I didn't recall from that time, they were saying that, there were absolutely remnants of explosive found on the plane. So right off the bat, nobody ever heard about that being confirmed. They did confirm that, yes, indeed, there were, explosives found on the plane, remnants of explosives. And, it's crazy because, they, at the time, apparently something like that had come out. And the government had said, oh, that plane got inspected, the day before or earlier in the day that it took off for, a routine, explosives inspection. And, just by chance there was residue. But they found out that no, there's no way that could have been that plane, because this plane, was taking off at the time that inspection was, occurred, and blah, blah, blah. Just so many different things that didn't add up. But the crazy part to me is, like, when you hear the stories of, like, the eyewitnesses, what they talk about is basically something that sounds like a handheld, like a Stinger missile getting shot up at the jet, from shore. And, like, there were a few people who were within, hundreds of yards of where this smoke trail came up and started going up into the sky. Like, one guy was, on the other side of a house, and he was, looking up at the sunset, and that's when, he saw it, and he said it was from pretty close. He could see the, like, smoke trail on the ground, which is pretty crazy. Like, you wouldn't think of something, like that, but the fact there's so much, like, corroborative evidence makes it pretty crazy. But the interesting part about that is that if that's the case, why would, what would be the point of covering that up? To, stop people from being scared of terrorism or something along those lines? Like, a terrorist act pre 9/11? Because who else would be out there with that type of a weapon to knock down, an airliner? Secondly, if that was the case, like, nobody claimed credit for it. So, usually, especially in that time, like, whenever something bad happens in the United States, terrorist organizations claim credit for their evil deeds, and nobody did. So again, like, all these different things, if it was the military, which seems less likely, well, given the eyewitness statements that, it came from, near land, which the Navy would have been out at sea, again, that also doesn't make sense. But one of the things that they covered, in the investigation was that they're basically, long story short, what they were showing was that in the wreckage, I think it was the right-hand wing, the forward edge of the right-hand wing, right next to the fuselage, like right where they meet, showed basically damage. Like, it was basically obliterated. That section of the wing was obliterated, whereas on the other side there was no damage. So if it was the center fuel tank, like they said, like, you would have expect to see damage on both sides. But secondly, the other interesting thing is you can see impact damage from something coming inward to the plane, not exploding outward on the fuselage, which again doesn't line up with an internal explosion. The third thing is that again with the explosive residues, it's just kind of really suspicious. But again, to what end? To what end are you covering that up? It doesn't make any sense. Because again, if it was like a crazy person who somehow got access to that type of a weapon, why go through so much trouble to try to cover it up when again, one slip up and everybody knows. The crazy part too is that when they looked back at these officials from the CIA and the FBI testifying about did you find explosive residue, and they all said yes, but they made it seem like no. It's crazy. Looking back at that time, like I don't remember all of these things. I just remember it was obviously the headline news, the ongoing saga during that time. But it's really crazy. That documentary, if you're bored, if you have a lot of time in your hands, it's definitely worth a watch. It's a little slow because it's pretty old at this point. I think it's 15 years old. But really, like when you look back at that time, it just brings it right back. Kind of like when you watch a video of 9/11. It brings back that time frame and like what was going on and what people were thinking. But post-pandemic with all the conspiracy theories there, and even 9/11. I mean, look at 9/11. The difference with 9/11 though is that the people with TWA Flight 800 making the claims about a cover-up are not like outside people who are using logical things and like that and data to surmise that that's what happened. With TWA Flight 800, it's literally the people who are responsible for, the crash investigation, which is crazy because all of the different things on there, people breaking in, data being changed, everything about that. There's so many different facts that they line up in there with the people who are actually there that it's amazing. It's crazy to me. And it's like, wow, this is very much the same type of environment that people look at 9/11 with. But years before that happened, and again, one plane, what would be the catalyst? What would be the reason to cover that up? I don't know, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.